Hi, my name is Nicholas Polston, and I'm going to be talking about a film made in 2016 called Birth of a Nation. While my partner has already talked about slavery shown in the movie 12 Years a Slave, I'm going to be sticking with how slavery is shown in the film Birth of a Nation. Starting with a little background of the story, this Birth of a Nation is based off a true story of Nate Turner. Nate Turner was a slave that grew up in the South. As a young boy, one of the slave owners, Elizabeth, taught Nate how to read using the Bible. As Nate was growing up, he used the Bible to learn to read and began preaching. Once Nate got older, his slave owners were approached by a man to see if they would be interested in sending Nate to preach to other slaves. And of course, the slave owners would get money for this as Nate preached. So Nate began to preach to the other slaves to kind of calm them down after the slaves had been getting a little restless. While out preaching, Nate was able to see some of the true horrors that some other slaves were having to endure. For example, one thing that he saw was a slave getting his teeth knocked out and being forced to swallow them. After seeing all these horrible things, Nate decided that his own slave owners were unjust. So Nate then led some rebellions against the slave owners, which ended up leading to his execution by hanging. This film had a couple different ideas about slavery when compared to some of the older films we watched. Being a newer film, it hit on some a lot tougher topics than some of the older films that had discussed slavery as well. One thing that I noticed in this film, it had a lot more violence than what the other films had shown. The other films had shown that there was violence, but not to the extreme of this film. For example, as I said before earlier, the scene of the slave getting his teeth knocked out and being forced to swallow them, that is a very violent thing to show. But it is an accurate thing to show because there was a lot more violence in this time era than what had been represented before on film. Another thing that I think this film showed a lot more of was the rage felt by the slaves. A lot of the films show that the slaves were unhappy and wanted to get out of the situation that they were in. But I feel like a lot of films had looked over the anger and the rage that these slaves felt by being in the position that they were at. I felt like A Birth of a Nation really highlighted those feelings and those emotions and put them as the main focus in this film to show how fed up the slaves were of their current situation. I also thought that it did a good job of showing the differences between the slave owners. For example, um, Nate was shocked when he saw some of the violence that was happening to some of the slaves because his owners did not go to that extent of violence. Throughout the film, though, you kind of see Nate's view change because he sees how those other slaves are treated and how even though he is not treated that badly, he is still considered their property and he still has a problem with that, and that is where his rage starts to build. I also think this film touches on a lot harder subjects, once again looking at the violence and the rage. As I said before, these things had not been seen in a lot of other films that discuss slavery. So I feel like this film did a good job of hitting on those points because that hadn't been seen before. And I believe that that's something that needs to be shown because it is a part of our history and we must learn from that in order to move on and to grow. Now we're going to look at how the film Birth of a Nation viewed slavery. We're going to break it down to a couple different topics and then go into detail about those topics. So, the first topic we're going to look at is how Birth of a Nation viewed slavery in an emotional aspect. As I said before, I thought the film focused a lot on the rage and the anger of the slaves. Um, these slaves were extremely unhappy with their current situation, and it boiled up inside them to the point of it showing that rage and that violence against their slave owners. This is something, as I said before, that hasn't been seen very often. So it hasn't been seen very often on film. So it is nice to see a film that kind of highlights more of what the slaves were feeling during that time of their slavery. I also thought that the film showed at some points some of the defeat that some of the slaves felt at the time. For example, there was a scene that stood out to me that talked about, as Nate was preaching, one of the men that he was preaching to, his wife was taken inside and we assumed was raped by the slave owner. And when she came back out, she was crying, and her husband consoled her, and he looked at Nate and said, "What about your God now?" I think that kind of shows that the slaves, they felt defeated. They felt that this was it. I feel like this film showed that the slaves were just broken down, um, both physically and emotionally. And usually we see in films them fighting back against slavery when the film talks about slavery, and we do see that in this film. But this film also highlights on that feeling of feeling of defeat aspect, which I enjoyed seeing. Now moving on to how the film viewed abuse within slavery. I thought the film going back to that defeat aspect, I think the film showed a lot of mental abuse to the slaves along with the physical abuse. Looking at other films, we usually see a lot of physical abuse to slaves in films about slavery. Um, while we see a lot of physical abuse, sometimes we don't see as much as the mental abuse. But the mental abuse was just as bad as the physical abuse. Having to see your loved ones get hurt or bad things happening to your family, that takes a toll on you mentally as well as physically. And I thought this film did a good job of pointing that out. For example, if you look at the picture that's above me, you can see kind of in the slaves' faces that defeat mentally and that drainage that they felt mentally because of their situation as a slave. Now moving on to the social, looking at how Birth of a Nation viewed slavery socially, starting with their economics. Being a slave, you don't make money for what you do, so you don't have any power. Back then, money was power. And so it was very hard for these slaves because they couldn't gain any power because of the cards that they were being dealt. So that led to the anger and the violence and the rage that I had discussed earlier. Um, and because that also leads to political. Once again, having money is power, but having power also means that you have a lot of influence politically. And so these slaves had no say politically. They had no power in what was happening to them or to other slaves at the time, whether they were freed or not. And this would be a really hard pill to swallow, which goes back to talking about the mental abuse that would take a toll on you mentally, knowing that you have no power to fight back, which then that could build up on the rage and the anger, which can lead to the rebellion. And in this case, it did lead to a rebellion. Now looking at how the film showed freedom of slaves at this time. It was such a big thing to be a freed slave at the time, but freedom came with a cost. And that cost was a hard life. Even though they were freed, it was still a very hard life to live because, once again, they were a freed slave, and yes, they could be making money for work, but the attitudes of a lot of people at that time were still that African Americans should be slaves. So it was hard to break through that glass in order to get a good paying job where you can make money, where you can get that power and make changes politically. It was, even as a freed slave, it was hard to make that first step because you were still seen, these freed slaves were still seen as inferior to a lot of people of the time. Looking at a conclusion of all these points, and seeing how slavery was really shown in the film Birth of a Nation, I thought one aspect that was very interesting was looking at how hope was seen in the two films. I thought back to the movies, to the films Spartacus, and how that led with some hope that it would get better. I thought this film was a little bit more realistic in how it gave hope, but it showed that that would be hard to come by. That final product that they were fighting for would be a very hard fight, but that there was hope to reach that point. I think that is shown in the final two scenes where Nate is finally hung, and that's kind of shows that there's no hope. But then the camera goes out to the little boy, and then you see that little boy grown up fighting next to an African American male in the Civil War, showing that it had been a long fight to get to that point, but there was still hope that they could get to that point. I think this is a very realistic scenario from what the time that they were in, because while these slaves had hope for a better life, I think they all knew that it would have to be fought the hard way. And I think the film shows that through the whole entire film, that because there is hope, it is worth fighting for. I also think that the film shows a lot more pain. It shows a lot more pain in the slaves through the mental and physical abuse that they had to do, but I also think that it shows the continuous pain of slavery and the long lasting effects of that pain leading up to the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and even today, that pain is still there, and there is a lot of healing to do to get that pain over with. And now going back to the violence of the film, I thought the film showed a lot more violence than what we had seen before, but I feel like this is more accurate in this film than in other films, because looking at history, we know that the time of slavery was a very violent time, and that the slave owners were very violent to their slaves, that some of them were very violent to their slaves. So it was interesting to see a film show that violence and really kind of highlight it, because a lot of films kind of gloss that over and they don't give you the full picture of what was really going on. And this film kind of dove right in to show you that, hey, this is what's going on, this is what happened. And once again, also found that the film was very interesting when it talked about when it showed the differences between the slave owners. I have discussed this in discussions and in my papers before, that sometimes films show that slave owners were all completely brutal and completely horrible, when a lot of them were, but some were not so much. There was a degree of difference between different slave owners, and I thought this film kind of showed that within their slave owners as well, which I thought was very interesting. All in all, I feel like this movie is one of the better representations of slavery that we have seen this semester, and I was very interested to watch it, as I said, because I think it shows more of an accurate representation of slavery.